All right. Well, hello everyone. Welcome. My name is Dalia, and I'm part of the developer marketing team here at Kong. I'm very happy to have all of you, to our Insomnia 2.1 workshop. We're going to be talking about how can Insomnia support real world API development and testing. We have Michael again here with us. He gave the Insomnia 1.1 workshop. So I will let him introduce himself one more time again to you. What we're going to do is take all of the questions in the Q&A function on the bottom. But if you have any difficulty problems following the workshop, please post in the chat so then we can resolve them. This workshop is being recorded, so you will receive a recording after that via email, and you will find it also on our YouTube channel. So with that, please, Michael, take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dalia, and welcome back, everyone, if you're here for the 101 workshop. If not, I definitely recommend checking that out, but welcome to the 201 workshop here. For folks that don't know me, I'm a product marketer at Kong, and so I have a good bit of experience here with Insomnia, and we're going to be doing a little bit of deeper dive today and trying to simulate a more of a real world use case and what it actually looks like to maybe build an API with Insomnia. So the agenda today at a very high level is first, we're just going to cover a couple of prereqs if you want to follow along with the workshop. Again, as Dalia mentioned, this is something we're going to be sending out a recording of after and basically all the information you need if you want to try this on your own later. But again, if you want to follow along, that's an option as well. And you'll just need to have everything listed inside of the prereqs. We'll spend a little bit of time recapping what we covered in Insomnia 101, just to see if that's of interest of you and make sure folks have the necessary background to complete this course. Then from there, we're pretty much going to dive straight into the 201 workshop, and we'll finish up and leave some time at the end for a Q&A. So as Dalia mentioned, if you have questions while we're going along, feel free to post them in the chat. And if a bunch of people get stuck somewhere, again, feel free to shoot a message. Dalia will be watching that closely, and we can always back things up and make sure people who are trying to follow along don't get stuck. Okay, so prereqs, if you want to follow along today, you really just need four things. You need some kind of text editor or IDE. We're going to be cloning a repo with some code in it. So, something like VSCode is going to make that a lot easier to work with. You need to have some kind of JavaScript runtime running locally. So most commonly, this is something like node.js that you can just run to actually utilize some of the functionality that exists inside of the repo. You're going to need access to Git, so that can be the CLI tooling, or you can utilize the interface inside of your IDE of choice. And then last but certainly not least, of course, you're going to need to have Insomnia downloaded, and you'll need an account to actually complete some of the things that we're going to be covering inside of the workshop today. So again, those are the four main things. Feel free to start looking at those now if you feel like you're missing one. But again, don't panic if you're missing something. We'll have a recording. You can always follow along later. Okay, so just a quick high-level recap of what we went through in the 101 workshop. Covered a lot of good stuff. So we really opened up things by just kind of talking about what is Insomnia, how does it fit into the overall Calm Connect platform? And, we talked about how Insomnia is really focused on that build stage and the role it plays and the different things you can actually do with Insomnia. Then we went right pretty much into the workshop and started looking at the overall interface of Insomnia so we can understand the object model and all the different capabilities inside there. We kind of took a design first approach where we had everyone import their first open API spec. We did some linting. We made some modifications and showed the different ways you could save your work inside of Insomnia. So basically kind of using something very similar to that Git type workflow. We sent some basic requests through and learned about all the tooling and different ways you can send requests inside of Insomnia. We showed the ability to use environment variables and dynamic elements and even use that to manage some of your secret elements. We filtered some of those responses that were coming through and showed some different use cases where you might want to do that. And then kind of towards the end, we showed how, from these requests, you can directly generate client code. And so use that in your language of choice, whether that's JavaScript or Python, and start integrating that into your application immediately. And then at the very end, we did a little bit of basic testing. And that's really going to be one of the focuses as we move into the 201 workshop today, is to go much, much deeper on testing. And we're going to kind of tie that to an actual real world API that we're going to make some modifications to based on what we're seeing inside of our test suite. All right, so before we get into the 201 workshop, we covered these slides before, but just want to do a quick recap for folks because this is by far the most common question we get is, why do I need an API client in the first place? Every computer nowadays or forever has had curl, and this is just a CLI tool I can use to send all these requests to my APIs. Why do I need this whole interface built out, and what does it provide me that I don't already get with curl? And again, since it's such a common question, I like to cover these kind of three main categories of where Insomnia really stands out here. So again, the first of these is collaboration. As we mentioned last time, APIs are not designed in silos. They're built in teams. And so you want to be able to work with your teams, but you still want to have the flexibility to choose how you want to share that data. So with Insomnia, you can store that data locally and back it up to a Git repo. You can push it to Insomnia Cloud, where everything's encrypted if you prefer working that way and for ease of use. And then additionally, you're going to have full role-based access control inside of Insomnia. If your whole team's working inside of here, you want to control who can access what APIs and what kind of permissions they have once they have access to those APIs. So again, the first piece of Insomnia is about enabling collaboration between these teams when you're actually building these APIs. Now, of course, again, as we mentioned last time, if you're going to collaborate, you want to do it securely. And so, again, with Insomnia, by default, everything is end-to-end encrypted inside of the cloud. Of course, we're going to be able to integrate with your single sign-on provider of choice. So, whether that's over OpenID Connect or SAML, it's up to you. We've also have full support for the SCIM protocol. And so again, what that allows you to do is inside of your identity provider of choice, you can manage all the permissions, the roles, and the team structures, and then map that directly over to Insomnia. So again, it kind of depends where you want to work for. Do you want to start directly inside Insomnia, or are you an enterprise that already is heavily invested in IDP, something like an Okta, and you want to manage all your permissions and teams from there? We talked a little bit about how you can set up private environments last time as well. So again, by default, the environments you create will be shared between your teams. But if you as a developer have your own API key, for example, you can create private environments, as we see here in the screenshot, that are not going to be shared with the rest of the team. And then one really important thing to call out here, because this was not available, it was about to come out during the 101 workshop, but very happy to announce with version 11, we now have a full secrets manager integration. And so this means if you store all your secrets in something like HashiCorp Vault, or you're using one of the major cloud providers, so GCP or AWS, and you utilize their secret manager today, you can now directly integrate that with Insomnia and pull those secrets in as environment variables. But again, they're still managed from some kind of third party, something like a HashiCorp Vault. So this is a huge, huge deal for a lot of enterprises and something we are very excited to include with the version 11 release of Insomnia. All right, so now moving on to this last kind of block here, and much more relevant to what we're going to be focusing on today, is talking about testing, mocking, and automation. Now, last time we mentioned automation, and we kind of pointed out that a lot of people, when they hear automation, they think speed and efficiency gains. When automation is really more about governance and guardrails, and having this repeatability that every time you make a change, it's integrated with your CI/CD pipeline, and you ensure that that feature change that you're making isn't introducing regressions or bugs. Now, we're going to be covering the automation aspect in the next course, so the 301 course. But before we can automate anything, we actually have to build out these testing pipelines. And so we're going to see how we do that inside Insomnia today, utilizing the scripting support built in. And then we're also going to show how we can leverage some mock servers to actually send requests, before you're even ready to publish the backend API that you're building or designing. Okay, so with that, we're going to go ahead and dive into the workshop now. So what I need everyone to do, if you want to follow along, is head over to this repo. And what I'll do real quick is I'll actually just post this inside the chat, so it's much easier for folks to grab. So let me do that real quick. Okay, so just sent that in here. Hopefully folks can see that and are able to access that. It should be set to a public repo. If there's any issues there, again, just send something in the chat and Dahlia will be tracking it. But that should give you access to the workshop. So go ahead and clone that locally, and we'll be working with that here in just a minute. But as a quick overview, I want to touch on what we're actually going to cover today. So again, anybody who wants to follow along, we'll set that project up locally. And then inside of that project, there's going to be some code. We're actually going to be working with an Express.js server. But there's also an Insomnia collection included in there. So inside of this Insomnia collection, there's going to be a testing suite that we're going to take some time to review and look through. We're going to show how we can actually run collections and iterate over these tests that we have set up. And at the end, we're going to take a little bit of time and show how we can quickly set up and test a mock server, even if we don't have a backend API that's publicly available and published yet. So let me just check here, make sure. So it looks like one person was not able to access, and somebody else was. If you could share your access area there, that would be great, and I can take a quick look at that. Looks like somebody else was able to, yep, just running the git clone on that command. Yep, it's public. So as long as one person is able to access, everybody should be able to just run that git clone command and pull that into their local folder. Again, if you guys want to send some steps over and some issues you're running to, I'm happy to take a look here at the end. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and dive into the actual workshop. So I'm going to get out of slide mode here, come back to the Q&A there at the end. All right, so for folks who have cloned things locally, this is what the project looks like here. Let me go ahead and minimize myself so I can see. So it's a super, super basic, again, Express.js server. So just looking at the index file here, basically the base path we're going to be using is items. So you can kind of think of this as the start to a very, very simple task manager or to-do list. And really the main things going on here is we have a data set that it starts with. So every time you spin up the server, there's always going to be two tasks already created here. There's no actual database. These are just going to be running in memory. It's just an array of JSON objects, and that's what we're going to be manipulating, reading, and adding to. And the way we're going to do that is through the different routes we have set up here. So if we take a look here, this is where the actual logic gets implemented for each of our endpoints. And we have 5 super basic endpoints. We have the ability to read all the items that are stored inside that array. We can call a specific one out by its ID. We can add a new one through a post request here. We can update existing items, again, by their ID and change things like the completion status. And then, of course, we can actually come in and delete items by their ID. And we'll be going a little bit deeper into the logic of some of these endpoints as we make modifications. But the next step here is to actually utilize the Insomnia collection that should also be included in what you cloned. So over here, you should see one called the Insomnia 201 starter collection. And that's the YAML file that we're actually going to import inside Insomnia now. So switching views here, I'll back out. I already had this set up. So people remember you can belong here to different organizations or workspaces. Everybody should have a personal workspace where they can go and create their own projects. Feel free to utilize an existing project, or if you want to create a fresh one, you can do that too and choose how you want to store your data, again, whether in the cloud or using your own external Git repo. But once you have that project set up, to go ahead and import this, just click the import button, choose the file, and then again, come over here and get that starter collection and bring that in. And you should be able to import that in directly. And you should see a collection here very similar to mine. So I'll go ahead and pause, just make sure folks are following there. Okay, looks like everyone can access, no issues. Okay, so let's take a closer look at what's inside this collection. So just like we had those 5 endpoints inside of our Express server, we have these 5 different requests set up inside of Insomnia. So again, we have the ability to create an item. We can return an item by a particular ID. We can return all the items. We can update items. We can delete items. We have a bunch of different functionality built in here. So first, let's take a look at what it looks like to create an item. So we have our base URL here. If I click on that, we can basically see it's going to our local server. So localhost 3000, and we have our items endpoint. Now, if I try to send a request in right now, we should just get an error because we don't actually have a server up and running. So this is where we actually want to start things inside of our Express server. So again, if you hop back to your IDE now, and you can open up your terminal inside of that IDE, the first thing everyone needs to run, if you haven't done it already, is run npm install, and that will install the packages that you need. That should be pretty quick. There's not many packages running here. And the next command we want to run, once we have everything up and running, it's just run npm run dev. And that's actually going to start our server locally. We can see now our server is running here on port 3000. So now if I go back to Insomnia and I try to send that same request in, we actually get a response back from that server. We can see a task or an item was successfully created, this 201, and we can see the response from that server and what that looks like. So what actually went on here? How do we actually create this task? Well, we actually provided a body in our request. So we can see here, we utilize an environment variable. And so we can have this environment variable of sample task. So let's jump over to our environment now and see what's included in there. And this will be included inside of everybody's Insomnia collection. So the basic stuff at the top is first we're defining this URL that's going to be shared between all the endpoints. So we're grabbing our protocol, which is just HTTP, our host, which is localhost because that Express server is running on your local machine. It's set up to be exposed over port 3000. And then we also have a base path of items. Because if you remember, if we go back and look at our server one more time, and we go to the index.js file, we can see this is prepended to all of our endpoints. And so we're doing the same thing inside of Insomnia. So that's how we're setting up our base URL there. Now we have three other environment variables in Node. We have the name one, which we just utilized when we actually created our first task or our first item. We have an updated name environment variable, and then we have this item ID. And at this point, this really looks like some type of Unix timestamp. Okay, so now let's go back here. And again, we can see that name was populated. So the only thing we provided here was the name of the task, sample task, and automatically it sets the completion status to false, and it gives us an ID. So again, this is just a Unix timestamp that is generated when that actual test or that task is created. Now there's some other things we can see here. So if I actually go here and try to return all the items now and send this request through, so we can see here now we have these two tasks that already existed. Remember when we looked at the data inside of our Express server, and then the new one that I just created here, the sample task. Now, if I didn't want to return all these items at once, I could also return an item by a specific ID. So if we do that here, we're going to notice now that in addition to this base URL, and we can see the full URL preview here, we have this path parameter here. Now, path parameter is nothing more than a variable that you actually include inside of the route. If you ever want to add one of these in, basically you start it out with a colon and then the name of the path parameter. And then you'll see it actually be able to pop up down here. Now, what's interesting is I can run this request, and again, we're getting that particular task back. But where was this item ID populated from? If we go back to our environment variables, we can see it's set here. It's ending in 041, but I didn't have to manually set that. So just to show, if I go ahead and create a new task, so we're going to come here, let's call this new task now. I go back, I create a new item, and we see 084. And I go and I just go run this return item by ID. And we can see the new task comes in here, and that environment variable is already set 084. And again, that's not something I manually did. That task was created. To go back to the create item, this ID was generated on the backend server, and then that ID was automatically added as an environment variable that can be then leveraged by these other endpoints. So how is that done? So this is where I want to take a little bit of time and talk about the scripting that you can do inside of Insomnia. And broadly speaking, there are kind of two types of scripting. So there's pre-request scripts, which do exactly what they sound like, is before the request actually goes to the backend service or API, you can run different scripts here. And again, these scripts it's all just JavaScript. And there's a lot of different things you can do. And so, you might need to automatically generate auth tokens. Might want to dynamically modify the request so you can have if-else statements based on certain conditions and what you want to do. And then what we're going to spend a lot of time today is looking at the after response. So we can run scripts here as well. So again, this is just JavaScript, and we'll walk through in more details what all is set up here. Now, predominantly, after response scripting is used to set up your tests. So we can see these different test cases that are inside these different if-else statements. Now, for the use case we just saw, we can see we got a 201 response. So this branch is going to run here. We can see we have a couple different test assertions, which again, we'll come back to and take a deeper look at here in just a moment. But at the end, we can see how that response ID is actually set inside the environment variable. So with the scripting, we have taken the response ID, which we see right here, and we have dynamically updated it and assigned it to the item ID environment variable. And so that happens automatically after every request. Now, a cool thing to call here too with the scripting is, this is your first time using this and, you don't know any of the things that you can do with a response. You can pull out these snippets. So, if I want to get the body as JSON or I want to get the status code, I can click on one of these snippets and it's basically automatically going to generate some code that we can then utilize. And this is actually what I've done at the top and the start. The first thing I do is I look at the response code coming in, and then I determine what I want to do next based on that response code. So that's just a basic introduction to some of the scripting there. And so let's take a closer look at what's going on with some of these tests. So again, for this 201 example, we basically see that we have three assertions here. Now, we basically explicitly call out, obviously it's going to be 201 because this is evaluated to true, but we want to run a test case there and make a direct assertion that we expect that code to be equal to 201. We also want to check and make sure that the response does include an ID field because that's the responsibility of the Express server on the back end to generate. So we're going to make that assertion as well. And then last, we want to check to make sure that the name field that is returned, one, it exists, and two, the property here matches. So we're checking in the response, we're checking for the name field, and then we want to make sure that that matches the name that's actually passed in the request body. So we're actually going to look at this variable, see that the name was sent, and make sure it matches exactly what's coming in the response so that there's no issues there or no unexpected behavior. And so we can see that every time we send that request here, we can see that these test cases run, and we can see the status of each of those tests. So in this case, it did quite well. It passed all three of the tests. Now, we can set this up for each of the individual endpoints. So if we go here, and again, same thing, if I run this request and I want to pull it by item ID, this is going to have all of its own tests as well. We send this request through. It also has three assertions on the 200, and it's checking for very similar things, and then those all passed. Now let's go here and take a look at when we actually go here and update an item. Actually, before we do that, let's go back to the post endpoint and let's take a look at what happens when we actually do up a 400. So the reason a test case exists for this is because there's a lot of times where people are going to have invalid input. And so inside the Express server, I basically define that. When we go back here, let's go to our routes. Now, when somebody creates an endpoint, we want to make sure that essentially that name is not empty. So we're basically going to make sure it's not just white space. You need to have some kind of characters in there. If that name is empty, we're basically just going to respond with a 400 and say, a name is required for your item. You can't just send us white space. And that's behavior that I want to test for as well, because this is something that might happen in the real world, and I want to have test cases built around that. So again, let's go now modify our environment variable. And let's just try to send an empty task here. So not really providing any real name, just white space. And then let's try to create that item. Okay, so we get a 400 and we get a response name as required. And so even though it was a failure from the perspective of the client, that's exactly how we want our API to behave for this use case. And so we also have two test case set up here, and these have both passed. Again, we're checking to make sure that that 400 status code was sent and make sure we're giving them some kind of information. In this case, we're telling them, hey, a name is required. And that's something that I want to happen anytime that they have a malformed API request. Now let's go ahead and let's send a correct one in again here. So we'll call this just our correctly formatted item. And again, that gets dynamically pulled in here. Let's go ahead and send that request. Okay, correctly formatted item. And then we can see that now if we return all of our items here. There's been a couple new ones generated, but the most recently generated one. Now, let's say I want to actually go ahead and update this item. So what this one looks like, again, it's going to utilize the item ID from that last post request. And so that's preset here. And then I want to update that item with a new name. So we should see an updated name here of V2 sample task. And I want to mark it as completed. So again, when we went back here, right now, it has this name and its completion is set to false. And we're going to try to update it through this endpoint. So I'm going to send this request through. And we can see that the name didn't change. It still says correctly formatted item. For some reason, it didn't pick up this updated name. And we can still see it's marked as completed false. So something's clearly going on here. And thankfully, this was captured inside of our test that we set up here. So if we look at our test here, we can see, okay, we did get a 200 response, and it did have a name field. But we can tell that that name field has not been properly updated. It didn't actually change. And we can also see that the completion status in the response has not been properly updated. And we can see these assertions carrying out in real time. So clearly the V2 sample task that we're trying to update does not equal the correctly formatted item that we got in the response. And then also we can see here that true, of course, does not equal false. And so that both of these test cases failed. So this is an alert that something's going on in our API or endpoint. So let's go take a closer look there. So we're going to go back now and look at our routes. And let's take a look here at this route that we're using to update our particular item. So again, we're looking for a particular item ID and then of course the put method here, and that will trigger this route or endpoint to run. First thing we do is check in our hypothetical database, which is again, just an array stored in memory here. And we're going to try to find an item inside there by the ID. And so we grab that item. Now, if we can't find that item, the first thing we say is, okay, 404, that item doesn't exist. And that's a proper use case. But if that doesn't occur, we notice here, all we do with that item is return back the exact item that we grabbed from the database. We didn't ever actually update that item in any way based off of what came in the request. So what we need to do now is I'm going to go over here and grab some code. And this is code that is also in a different branch inside of the repo that you cloned. So it'll be quite easy to get back to. Go ahead and drop this in here. So before we return the item, of course, we want to actually update it. So we're going to look at the body name, confirm that it's a string. We're going to trim that name down, and then we're going to set the item's new name. So again, we're going to modify inside of that JSON structure we see there, is we're going to change the name by what they provided inside of the request body. And then same thing, we're going to make sure it's a Boolean, and then we're going to update the completion status of the item based on the completion status provided inside of the request body. And that updated item now is what we should be returning back to the end user. So with that change, and as long as you save here, the server will automatically restart and update with that change. So let's go ahead and try that one more time. So let's go back to Insomnia here. And let's go ahead and send that request again. And okay, now we got a missing ID. So let's go ahead and create the item one more time. So let's give it a new name. Create the item. Okay, so it's been created. Let's make sure we can actually see it here. Okay, new name. And the reason that item disappeared is, again, when we made that change to our server, it restarted the server. And since this is all stored in memory, we lost that item that just existed. So now that the server's restarted, I need to create that item again. So we can see it here. The ID's been saved. Now I want to update that item. So I'm going to go ahead and make this put request here. We get a 200. And now we can see all 4 of our tests have passed. The name and the response. V2 sample task does match what we passed here as our updated name, V2 sample task. And then we also set the completion status to true, and we can see that is now the case in the response as well. So now this endpoint is behaving as expected. Now, obviously, that was a bit of a contrived example of what test cases could cover, because as the number of endpoints start to grow and the number of APIs start to grow, this is going to be a much more difficult thing to monitor. You're not going to come in here and run each of these requests individually. What you're going to want to set up is some kind of full collection run to go through all your existing endpoints. Well, thankfully, that is going to be built directly inside of Insomnia as well. So let's open up our collection runner. So up here, kind of in the top left, you can click Run here. So this opens up our collection runner. And so what this allows you to do is basically select which endpoints you want to run. So we're going to do a run with everything. So we're going to select all. We can select the number of iterations, and we'll come back to iterations later. For now, we'll just do one if there's any delay between your iterations. And we're going to go run this collection now to run all of our tests across all of our API endpoints. And now, since we made that change, we can see in our first iteration, we can see we ran 3 tests for the create item endpoint, 3 tests for returning by ID, 2 tests for returning all items, 4 for updating that item, and we ran just 1 test when we actually wanted to delete that item. But everything passed here. And so this is much more close to what you'd actually experience when you are like, if you're making a change to an API or an update, you'd have your collection runner then come through and hit all your endpoints. You can get this summary of all the tests that were run for this particular collection. Now, another important thing to note, though, is right now the data being passed in there is static, right? So what I've done is it's basically going to utilize these environment variables. Again, this new name, the update is going to use the name I passed here. And then, of course, we're just going to run the get request and then the delete request utilizing this item ID. But this doesn't really simulate what you actually might see inside the real world, right? So in the real world, you could have hundreds or thousands of clients sending all sorts of different data. And it can be much more difficult to capture these edge cases if all the input data you have is static. It's really, really important to validate against multiple inputs so you can catch these different edge cases. And it can also help you find like if your API is behaving in kind of a non-deterministic way or it's stateful when it shouldn't be. This can make these bugs that are much, much harder to find by just doing a code review much, much more clear and easy to see. And this is a cool thing that you can do in Insomnia as well. So again, I could just bump up the number of iterations, but I'm still sending the same data every single time. So what we want to do is we actually want to upload some data to basically dynamically populate each of these endpoints for every iteration. And so the way we're going to do that is if you look back inside of the Git repo that everyone should have cloned, is you're going to see the CSV file inside of here. And it's going to be our collection runner variables. It's basically just a column of variables. And for basically every row you have inside of that CSV, that will be another iteration. And it can pull those variable names in by the headers. And so let's see if I can actually open this up. Yeah, so the column names we have here are name and updated name. And then we have a bunch of different names and we have different updated names. And again, each row here, so we have 10 rows if we exclude the actual header column. So when I import this, it should do 10 iterations, and then any environment variables that match name or updated name for the collection run, these values will take priority over what do we have inside of our actual environment. So basically every iteration will actually use these instead of what we'd assigned inside of our environment variables previously. So let's go ahead and give that a run. So we're going to go ahead and upload data, select data file. We're going to go ahead and grab that CSV file, open that here. All right, so the encoding, just be safe, we'll switch that to the UTF-8 coding. And again, now we can see a preview of what we're actually importing. Basically, every iteration is going to have somebody sending a different name for each of the item. We can see we have like one that's completely blank. So we should be able to test our 400 cases as well. And then we have some updated names to make sure our put endpoint is working correctly. So as soon as we upload that, we can now see automatically it set the 10 iterations to cover every row inside of that file. So let's go ahead and run that. So pretty quickly, it's done and run through. But interestingly, all these iterations, which should have been quite similar, instead of a perfect 127 out of 127, we do have one failed test case. So if we scroll down and take a look, okay, so on iteration 3, we had a failure, and for some reason, the response has a name field that doesn't actually match what's inside the request body. So let's take a closer look at what's going on here. So it's basically expecting to have we have the name write unit test, but then we did get write unit test. But if we look closely, we can actually see there's a bit of white space here that shouldn't be there. For some reason, the white space wasn't actually trimmed. So this was a bug that was hard to catch. So basically somebody put a space in here, and for some reason that wasn't trimmed and it was stored inside the database with that white space in front. So let's go back and look at our code and maybe try to figure out what's going on here. So if we go back to our items, and let's look at our post request now. So let's just do a quick walkthrough of the logic we have inside of this endpoint. So the first thing we do is extract the name provided from the request body. Okay, it looks like we do then trim that name. So basically we remove any leading and trailing white space here. And then all we check is based off of that trim name, and this is what we checked earlier, is make sure it's not completely blank. If you send nothing but white spaces and then you run the trim function, it's going to be an empty string, and we're going to send back a 400, the name is required. And then what we do is we generate an ID, which again is a Unix timestamp. We provide the name and we set the completion status to false. And then we push that item into the array and we return it to the user. But if we look closely here, we can see what the actual bug is. So instead of using the trim name variable that we set up here, we actually just grab the original name. And so what that's done now is we basically have put in the name that still includes the white space inside of the database and return that to the user. So what we actually want to do here is update this to trim name. Again, just like previously, I want to go ahead and save. Now let's return to Insomnia and start running this collection again with just that one change, see if we caught our bug correctly. All right, and just like that, we got 127 out of 127. So again, something that would have been much harder to find potentially, could have been very easy to miss early on. By having this kind of variety in all these different iterations and testing these different inputs in a much more dynamic fashion, we're able to catch that inside of our testing suite. So again, especially when you have rapid development of your APIs and changes being made quickly, you're going to introduce bugs. That's why you want to have these unit tests on side every single one of your endpoints. Okay, so now I do want to mention that obviously we're still running this manually. We're running this inside of the UI. The 301 course will be focused on taking this and how do we actually integrate this inside of a CI/CD pipeline? So how do we take the structure that we designed here and have this run in an automated fashion for us? So somebody doesn't actually have to come in here, upload the data they want to run, and then run these and then come and manually check them. You want this to be a part of your pipeline. And so that's something, again, that we're going to go ahead and cover in the 301 course. But the last things I want to touch on here now is inside this 201 course is the ability to mock up these different endpoints. Now, you can take a couple different approaches with mocking. Like in the 101 course where we took a design or a spec-driven approach to our API building, could start out with a spec and generate your mock servers from there. So you might have no backend logic. You might not have any of this code built out already, but you can use the mock servers from there, just from that initial spec, and then immediately start generating responses so people can start working and testing these APIs out before you've written any code. Another approach is kind of more what we've done here, where we have some code written out, but everything's just running locally. I might still be making a lot of changes. Things might still be in flux. So I'm not really ready to, have this up and running anywhere publicly in any kind of server. The API is still very unstable. But, perhaps I have a team of front-end devs that want to start testing these new endpoints and really don't want to wait for me to publish a server. So this is where mocking can come into play. So if we go back to one of these API requests we've already sent, we can see here next to our testing tab that we have this mock tab as well. And what this allows us to do is take the most recent response and based on the structure here is automatically generate a mock endpoint. So if you have an existing mock server, you can add it there. If you have an existing route, you can overwrite it. I don't have either. So we're going to create something brand new here. So the route here is just going to the items, which again, it's grabbing from the URL that we already had. We're going to go ahead and submit this. And now we are inside of our mock server where I can create as many new routes as I want. And again, I could come here and import additional ones. So if I wanted to add a second one here, I can utilize an existing server, which was just created for us. I want to create a new route. This is also going to be using the items route, but it's going to be using a different method. So I'm going to have to, let's go ahead and use this one. Same thing. Okay, so that's been generated. So now we have these different endpoints that we can use for our initial testing. And so if I send in a test request, we can see now it's automatically set that JSON response. And again, we can see the body here. If we wanted to modify that in some aspect, we can return mock headers. And what you can do here is you have two options with your mock servers. You can let us host them in the cloud for you, which is the default behavior and what we have set up here. Or you can run these mock servers locally. So, if you need to be firewalled or air gapped and you want to run a mock server there, that's an option as well. Definitely the easier way to get started here is just to utilize the cloud mock server. And if we actually go and look at the URL here, we can see it's not actually hitting localhost. It's going to this mock server hosted in the cloud. So I can go ahead and copy that. And just to show the functionality here, if I switch over to my terminal view and I want to send a request there, it's essentially the same as a curl request. We can see, okay, we got the 201 response and we got what's going to mirror or mock what we expect to be in the real API, which is this JSON body with these three fields. And again, this is something people can start hitting and using now, while the actual API is still under active development and things might still be a little bit unstable. Okay, so the last thing I do want to show here too is, again, while you're doing these testing or if you want to at any point, we mentioned this in the last call, but of course, based off of these, you come here and generate client code inside of your library of choice. So again, if you want to use the fetch API for JavaScript, or you want to switch over to Python and you want to use the request library, which I definitely recommend, you can go ahead and grab these and start again working in your programming language of choice to also go and hit these endpoints. But I think that is going to about wrap up, I think, everything I wanted to cover here in the 201 workshop as it pertains to a deeper dive on testing and an introduction to the mock servers. And so I think I'll go ahead and pause there and see what kind of questions we have.
There are just some comments in the chat.
All right, so we got one asking what we mean by Insomnia. So again, Insomnia, that is the API client. That's the whole focus of these workshops is looking at this API client and testing tool in depth. So again, you can go download there to the link that was provided in the chat. And it looks like we have a big fan there saying it's a blessing from God. So awesome to hear that. What are the AI-based features? I would say stay tuned on that. We do have some exciting stuff coming up on our roadmap that we'll be kind of releasing and announcing to the public soon. And it looks like we don't have any direct questions, but we'll hang here for a minute or two to see if there is anything. But appreciate everyone taking the time to join today.
Thank you so much, Michael. And thanks for everyone for joining. But let's see if we have any questions for Michael now. Now is the time to ask. Please use the chat or the Q&A. And if not, you can also ask us on our community Slack. Let me put the link here for all of you to join. Let's wait for like 2 more minutes to see if people have any questions.
I do see one earlier I missed because it's after I passed the link asking if we support gRPC testing. And yes, we do. That's fully supported out of the box.
Okay. I don't think we have any other questions, but the recording will be sent to all of you either today or early tomorrow, and you will find it on our YouTube channel. Let me also put the link to that so you have it. All right. Well, thank you all. Just FYI for everyone, we will be hosting an Insomnia Developer Day, which will be an online event with probably two presentations and maybe the third workshop. We'll see. But stay tuned. It will be late May. We will announce it soon and you will all receive an invitation for it. Yeah, Michael, thank you so much again for the workshop. Thanks everyone for joining. If you have any questions, join us on Slack and we'll see you the next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.